Welcome to the world of science fiction where extraordinary tales come to life. Enjoy the journey. Ted Wilson groaned as he slammed the hood of Mr. Henderson's ancient truck shut. His knuckles throbbed from yet another slip of his wrench, and his patience was wearing thin. The old rancher had promised a quick oil change, but as always, quick had turned into hours of wrestling with rusted bolts and decades of neglect. By the time Ted locked up Blackwater Auto Repair and climbed into his beat-up Chevy Silverado, it was well past sunset. The drive home was uneventful, just miles of open prairie under a darkening Wyoming sky. Ted's mind wandered as he thought about the cold beer waiting in his fridge and the hot bath he desperately needed. His small ranch house appeared on the horizon, its crooked front porch illuminated by a single flickering bulb. It wasn't much, but it was home. Inside, Ted tossed his keys into a ceramic bowl on the counter and headed straight for the fridge. He cracked open a can of beer and took a long sip before turning toward the bathroom. Tonight was going to be about relaxation. No interruptions, no stress. Or so he thought. The bathroom was already filled with steam when he returned from setting up his bath time ritual. A spiked lemonade, his waterproof radio tuned to country classics, and a fresh towel draped over his shoulder. As he stepped inside, he froze. The bubbles in his bathtub were moving. No, surging. Before he could process what was happening, they parted like curtains in a theater. Rising from the water was someone, or something, entirely unexpected. Her skin shimmered like polished amethyst under the bathroom light. Crystalline structures adorned her head like a crown that glowed faintly with an internal light. Water cascaded down her tall frame as she stood there, very naked and very alien. Ted's brain short-circuited. His mouth opened and closed several times before any sound came out. What? Who? What are you doing in my tub? The alien woman's eyes widened before she let out an ear-piercing scream. Intruder. You dare breach the royal bathing chamber. Ted stumbled backward into the sink, knocking over his glass of lemonade in the process. Your bathing chamber. Lady, this is my bathroom. The woman raised an arm imperiously, water dripping from her elbow onto the tiled floor. Kneel before Princess Alanira Cavaris, heir to the crystalline throne of Saluran. Princess who? Ted managed to sputter as he grabbed for a towel to cover himself. Lady, I don't care if you're Queen of Mars. You're standing naked in my bathtub. Alanira looked around at her surroundings with growing confusion and disdain. This cannot be right, she muttered. The emergency teleportation system should have brought me to safety. Well, Ted said dryly, it brought you here instead. Alanira stepped out of the tub with regal poise despite dripping water all over Ted's floor. She examined him critically before speaking again. You are human. Last I checked, Ted replied. She frowned deeply. Then explain why my crown has malfunctioned. It should have located a secure throne-like structure befitting my station. Ted blinked at her words before glancing at his toilet. A horrible suspicion began forming in his mind. Wait. When you say throne-like structure, you don't mean. Before he could finish his thought, sparks erupted from the glowing crown atop Alanira's head. She gasped in pain as its light flickered violently before dimming completely. What just happened? Ted asked as she staggered forward. The crown, she whispered weakly. It's dormant. Without it, I cannot return home. Ted caught her just before she collapsed onto the floor. For a moment, they stayed frozen like that, him holding an unconscious alien princess, while Dolly Parton sang cheerfully from his radio about working 9 to 5. Well, he muttered under his breath, this is definitely not how I plan my evening. Ted stared at the unconscious princess sprawled across his bathroom floor, her amethyst skin glistening under the harsh overhead light. The crown on her head looked like a dead circuit board now, its crystals dull and cracked. He rubbed his temples, trying to process the surreal scene. Alien royalty. In his bathroom. Naked. Okay, Ted. He muttered to himself. First things first. He grabbed a spare blanket from the linen closet and draped it over her, trying not to stare at the intricate patterns etched into her arms. They shimmered faintly, like circuitry beneath her skin. "Mom," he said softly, "you need to wake up." Elanira stirred, her eyes snapping open with a warrior's alertness. She sat up abruptly, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Where am I?" "You're in my house," Ted replied, gesturing vaguely. "In Wyoming. Earth." She stared at him, then at the bathroom. "This is a throne room." Ted sighed. "It's a bathroom. The toilet's the throne. And you're not exactly dressed for the occasion." Elanira's gaze dropped to the blanket, and for the first time, Ted saw a flicker of embarrassment. "I apologize. The crown's failure must have disrupted my emergency protocols." "Protocols? Clothing generation," she explained, tapping her crown. "It usually manifests appropriate attire upon arrival." Ted blinked. Well, it didn't work this time. She stood, blanket clutched tightly around her. "I require assistance. The crown's recharge cycle is 14 Earth days. Until then, I am stranded." Ted hesitated. He wasn't exactly the hospitality type, but leaving her on his floor felt wrong. "There's a spare bedroom upstairs. You can stay there." Elanira nodded curtly. "I accept your offer, human." The next morning, Ted woke to the sound of his kitchen cabinets slamming shut. He groggily made his way downstairs to find Elanira rummaging through his pantry, blanket still wrapped around her. "Looking for something?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. "Food," she said, holding up a can of beans. "This is sustenance." "Yeah, but you might want to heat it up first." She stared at him. "You consume cold, metallic containers." Ted chuckled. "No, we open them. Let me show you." He demonstrated how to use a can opener, watching as she tentatively took a bite of lukewarm beans. Her face contorted. "Terrible," she declared, "but I will endure." Mrs. Gladys Harper peered through her curtains, binoculars pressed to her face. The Wilson boys' house was usually quiet. Too quiet, if you ask her. But today, there was movement. A shadowy figure darted past the upstairs window. "Mom," she murmured, jotting notes in her gossip journal. "Ted's got a guest, and they're wearing a blanket." Ted spent the day teaching Elanira basic Earth customs. She learned to use the shower, though she insisted on purifying the water with her crown's residual energy, how to wear his oversized sweatpants, and the concept of money. "You trade pieces of paper for goods?" she asked, staring at a $20 bill. "Or plastic cards," Ted said, swiping his debit card at the grocery store. She frowned. "Your species is trusting." "Or stupid," Ted muttered, loading milk into the cart. That night, Gladys knocked on Ted's door. He answered to find her holding a plate of lemon bars. "Brought you some dessert, Ted. Thought you might be lonely out here." Ted forced a smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Harper. You're too kind." "Not at all, dear. Though I did notice, you've got a light on upstairs. You're not entertaining company, are you?" Ted's heart skipped a beat. "Nope, just me and Netflix." Glady's eyes narrowed. "I could have sworn I saw someone moving around your living room earlier. Tall, purple." Ted laughed. "You must have seen my new mannequin. I'm, practicing my fashion skills." Gladys raised an eyebrow. "Fashion skills? Yeah, I'm thinking of starting a blog." She huffed. "Well, just be careful, Ted. Strangers can be trouble." As the days passed, Elanira grew more adept at Earth life. She learned to make coffee, though she insisted on infusing it with her crown's energy, helped Ted fix his broken fence, and even bonded with his grumpy old cat, Mr. Whiskers. But Ted noticed something else. Whenever she spoke of her home planet, her voice tightened. "Tell me about Saluran," he said one evening as they sat on the porch. Elanira stared at the stars. "It is a place of beauty, crystal spires that sing with energy. But my uncle, Lord Voss, seeks to destroy it. He believes power should be seized, not earned. Ted frowned. And you're the only one who can stop him. She nodded. I am the rightful heir. But without my crown, I am nothing. Gladys watched from her window as Ted and the blanket woman sat on the porch, laughing. She scribbled furiously in her journal. Definitely not a mannequin. The next morning, Ted found Alanira in his garage, tinkering with his old motorcycle. What are you doing? He asked, startled. Attempting to repair this vehicle, she said, holding up a spark plug. Your tools are primitive, but functional. Ted blinked. You know how to fix engines. Saluranian engineers are trained in all forms of energy manipulation, though I prefer crystal resonance to combustion. He watched as she effortlessly rewired the bike's ignition. You're a princess who knows how to hotwire a motorcycle. She smiled, a rare, genuine smile. A ruler must be adaptable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ted realized something strange. He was enjoying her company, but as he glanced at her crown, still dark and silent, he knew their time was limited, and he wasn't the only one watching. From the shadows of the nearby woods, a figure adjusted his rifle scope. Target acquired. The air was crisp when Ted stepped outside to check the fence posts he'd repaired with Alanira's help. She stood beside him, her crown glinting faintly in the morning light, a sign its recharge was progressing, though slowly. You're quiet today, Ted said, hammering a nail into a weathered board. I am calculating probabilities, she replied, her voice distant. If my uncle's forces track me here, they will not hesitate to destroy this town. Ted paused, his grip tightening on the hammer. You think they'd follow you to Earth? The crown's emergency teleportation leaves a residual energy signature. It is only a matter of time. Before he could respond, a rustling echoed from the nearby woods. Alanira's head snapped toward the sound, her hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Stay here, Ted whispered, grabbing his rifle from the porch. He crept toward the trees, scanning the underbrush. A twig snapped. Ted Wilson, a low, gravelly voice called out. You're harboring a fugitive. Ted froze. Emerging from the shadows was a man unlike any he'd ever seen. Tall, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed faintly red. A rifle hung at his side, its barrel etched with alien symbols. Who are you? Ted demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. Karen Voss, the man replied, his gaze flicking to Alanira, who now stood behind Ted. And you, princess, are a relic of a dying regime. Alanira stepped forward, her crown pulsing weakly. You will not take me alive, Karen. Karen smirked. I don't need to. My employer wants you dead. Ted didn't think. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot missed Karen by inches, but it gave them time to retreat. Alanira grabbed Ted's arm, pulling him toward the barn on the outskirts of town. Why did you do that? She asked breathlessly as they ran. You're my guest, Ted said, glancing over his shoulder. Karen was gaining ground. The barn loomed ahead, its wooden slats weathered to a soft gray. Alanira yanked open the creaky door, and they ducked inside just as Karen's rifle fired, splintering the doorframe. Your species is surprisingly resilient, Alanira said, panting. Ted leaned against a stack of hay bales. We're full of surprises. Karen circled the barn, his footsteps deliberate. You can't hide forever, princess, he shouted. Alanira examined the barn's layout, her eyes narrowing. This structure has potential. The wooden beams could be repurposed as projectiles. Ted blinked. You're gonna fight him with hay. Not hay, she said, her crown flickering as she focused. Energy. The barn erupted into chaos. Alanira used her crown's residual power to ignite the hay, creating a smokescreen. Ted grabbed a pitchfork, charging at Karen as the bounty hunter stumbled through the flames. You're no soldier, Kieran snarled, swinging his rifle like a club. Ted ducked, jabbing the pitchfork into Kieran's leg. The alien roared, stumbling backward. "Run!" Elanira shouted, grabbing Ted's arm. They sprinted through the smoke, emerging into the bright sunlight. Kieran's curses echoed behind them, but he didn't follow. Back at Ted's house, Elanira collapsed onto the couch, her crown dimming further. "You risked your life for me," she said quietly. Ted shrugged. "You're my guest. Besides, I've dealt with worse than some guy with a glowy rifle." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You are not like other humans I have studied." "Good?" "Confusing." Gladys Harper watched from her window as Ted and the blanket woman returned, covered in soot. She scribbled furiously in her journal. "Definitely not a mannequin. And now there's a man with a rifle." That night, Ted found Elanira in his garage, tinkering with his motorcycle again. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Modifying this vehicle," she said, attaching a strange device to the engine. "If Kieran returns, we will need mobility." Ted raised an eyebrow. "You're turning my bike into a spaceship." "Not a spaceship," she said, "but it will now achieve higher velocities and—" A loud crash echoed from outside. Kieran stood in Ted's front yard, a squad of armored aliens behind him. "Last chance, princess," he sneered. Elanira stepped forward, her crown glowing faintly. "I will not go quietly." Ted grabbed his rifle, but he knew they were outnumbered. "Run," Elanira said, her voice low. "I will handle this." Ted hesitated. "Go," she shouted, shoving him toward the garage. The motorcycle roared to life as Ted sped away, watching in the rearview mirror as Elanira faced Kieran's forces alone. Her crown flared, sending the armored aliens flying, but she stumbled backward, overwhelmed. Ted slammed on the brakes. "Damn it," he muttered, turning the bike around. The battle was chaotic. Ted fired his rifle wildly, hitting nothing but air. Elanira fought with a grace he'd never seen, her movements almost crystalline. But Kieran's forces were relentless. Just as all hope seemed lost, a pickup truck skidded into the yard. Sheriff Hank Calloway leaped out, shotgun in hand. "Need some help, Ted," he drawled. Ted stared. "How'd you—" "Mrs. Harper called me," Hank said, firing at an alien. "Said there was a purple lady and a guy with a glowy rifle. Figured it was Tuesday." The tide turned. Hank's arrival rallied the townsfolk, who emerged with rifles and pitchforks. Kieran's forces retreated, but not before the bounty hunter vowed, "This isn't over, princess." As the dust settled, Elanira stood panting, her crown pulsing weakly. Ted approached her, his heart still racing. "You okay?" She nodded. "But we cannot stay here. Kieran will return with more forces." Ted glanced at Hank, who was chatting with Gladys like they were at a church potluck. "We'll figure it out," Ted said. That night, Elanira sat on the porch, her crown glowing faintly. "You should leave," she said, not looking at Ted. "Where would I go?" "Somewhere safe." Ted sighed. "You're not exactly blending in, princess." She turned to him, her eyes softening. "I am sorry for bringing danger to your town." Ted shrugged. "It's not every day we get aliens and shootouts. Keeps things interesting." Elanira smiled, a small, weary smile. As the stars came out, Ted realized something. He didn't want her to leave, but he knew she had to, and he had no idea how to stop it. The sun had barely risen over Blackwater when Ted's phone rang. It was Sheriff Hank Calloway, his voice tight with urgency. "Ted, we've got a problem. Kieran Voss just rolled into town with a convoy of armored trucks. They're heading straight for your place." Ted's gut twisted. He glanced at Elanira, who stood by the kitchen window, her crown pulsing faintly. "We're not here," he lied. "Don't play dumb, boy," Hank said. "Mrs. Harper's already called me twice. You've got till noon to get out of there." Ted and Alanira fled to the abandoned mine on the outskirts of town, a relic from Wyoming's mining days. The air inside reeked of decay, but it offered cover. "We can't stay here," Alanira said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They'll find us. They'll find the whole town first," Ted muttered, peering through a cracked window. Kieran's forces were gathering at the edge of Blackwater, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. Hank Calloway stood in the town square, shotgun slung over his shoulder. "All right, folks," he told the gathered residents. "We've got a situation. Stay inside. Let the professionals handle it." Gladys Harper crossed her arms. "I've lived here 40 years, Hank. I ain't hiding." The attack began at noon. Kieran's forces stormed Blackwater, firing indiscriminately. Ted and Alanira sprinted back to town, the princess's crown flaring as she deflected bullets with a flick of her wrist. "Get behind me," she shouted, shielding Ted with her body. "You're not exactly bulletproof," Ted yelled back, grabbing a fallen rifle. The battle raged through the streets. Hank's deputies traded fire with Kieran's men, while Gladys lobbed jars of her famous pickles at the invaders. Alanira fought with a precision Ted had never seen, disarming foes with her crown's energy, using the town's water tower as a makeshift shield. But Kieran's forces were relentless. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Ted found himself cornered in a local diner. Kieran sneered, his rifle trained on Ted's chest. "You're a fool for protecting her," he spat. Ted shrugged. "She's my guest." Before Kieran could fire, Alanira slammed into him, her crown blinding him with light. Ted took advantage of the distraction, tackling Kieran to the ground. The tide turned when Hank's reinforcements arrived. Farmers with pitchforks, teenagers with baseball bats. Kieran's forces retreated, leaving their leader unconscious in the diner's parking lot. As the dust settled, Alanira stood panting, her crown dimming. Ted approached her cautiously. "You okay?" She nodded, her shoulders sagging. "I underestimated their numbers." Ted handed her a bottle of water. "You did all right for a princess." Gladys Harper marched up to them, her hair disheveled but her eyes blazing. "You two owe me an explanation." Alanira straightened, regal despite her sweat-stained sweatshirt. "I am Princess Alanira Cavaris, Ith of Saliren. My uncle seeks to overthrow me." Gladys snorted. "Well, he's welcome to try again. But next time, warn us. We'll bring the chili." That night, Ted and Alanira sat on the porch, watching the stars. Her crown glowed faintly now, only a few days left before it recharged fully. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. Ted shrugged. "Where'd I go?" "The moon." She smiled, a small, weary smile. "You could come with me." Ted's heart skipped a beat. "To Saliren." "Why not?" she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard. "You're different. Most humans would have abandoned me by now." Ted looked at her, really looked. The alien princess who'd commandeered his bathtub, fixed his motorcycle, and fought for his town. "I'll think about it," he said finally. As they sat there, the silence between them felt heavier than any crown. The final days passed in a blur of quiet moments and unspoken tension. Ted watched Alanira's crown grow brighter each morning, its crystals humming with renewed energy. She practiced her royal speeches in the barn, her voice echoing off the rafters as she rehearsed rallying her people. "You're gonna need a bigger audience than Mr. Whiskers," Ted said one afternoon, nodding at the cat lounging in the sun. Alanira smiled, a rare sight. "He is a discerning critic." Gladys Harper arrived unannounced with a plate of lemon bars. "For the princess," she said gruffly, eyeing Alanira's crown. "You're leaving soon, ain't ya?" Alanira nodded. "My crown will be fully charged by dawn." Gladys snorted. "Well, don't forget to write. We'll miss you." That night, Ted found Alanira in his garage, tinkering with the motorcycle. She'd added a small crystal pendant to the handlebars. "A gift," she said, "for the human who taught me to ride." "You're really leaving," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She turned, her eyes shining faintly. I must reclaim my throne. But you could come with me. Ted hesitated. Salduran, alien politics, a life beyond his wildest dreams. I'll stay here, he said finally. Elanira nodded, though her lips trembled. I expected as much. But know this, Ted Wilson, you are the first human to ever call me friend. Dawn broke cold and clear. Elanira stood in Ted's front yard, her crown blazing with light. The townsfolk gathered quietly. Hank, Gladys, even Mr. Henderson, who'd finally fixed his truck. Thank you, Elanira said, her voice carrying across the prairie. For shelter, for trust, for teaching me that even the humblest of thrones can hold great power. Ted stepped forward, his throat tight. You're welcome. The teleportation began as a shimmer, then a blinding flash. When the light faded, Elanira was gone. But on Ted's porch, a small crystal pendant glowed softly, a piece of her crown left behind. Epilogue. Months later, Ted received a package in the mail. Inside was a hologram of Elanira, standing on a crystal throne, her crown shining. Ted Wilson, she said, her voice warm. I have reclaimed my throne. But I will never forget the human who showed me that true strength lies not in power, but in kindness. Come visit someday. Salduran could use a mechanic. Ted smiled, tucking the hologram into his pocket. As he walked back to his garage, Mr. Whiskers sauntered out, tail twitching. Yeah, Ted muttered. I'll think about it.